So in thinking about education, by 1955, we have the elements of the Brown decision in place, including the court order calling for desegregation of schools with all deliberate speed. But there were other fronts. And we see this in different ways in different places. But let me just suggest, even though wasn't going to talk about it, let me just suggest that in 1955, there's an event that occurs in Mississippi which takes on a sort of national stature, and that's the death of a young man who was about 14 years old. His name's Emmett Till. Till is visiting his grandparents down in Mississippi. He's from Chicago. His parents had moved north as part of that larger migration of peoples from the South, and particularly African Americans from the South. But he'd gone back in 55, the summer, to visit family, and had made the mistake, because it was always a possibility of making a mistake, but he made the mistake of whistling at a white woman. And that's just something you didn't do if you were an African-American male in the South and in Mississippi. And what happens is, the night following the incident, some white men, including this woman's husband, will come to the house. They'll take Emmett Till, and he'll disappear. His body is later found submerged with an industrial fan tied around his neck. And this is a bit graphic, but he's found submerged, his body's found submerged, and he had been beaten and murdered. Now think about it. What was the crime? He whistled, or was said to have whistled. We don't actually know, but really the crime was being black, being male at that time in Mississippi, because there were these cultural structures in place that we refer to as segregation, Jim Crow. And whether he wasn't fully aware or believed that he was immune to the potential for violence that accompanied breaking these unwritten codes of conduct, he paid the ultimate price. His body was brought back to Chicago. And it's a fascinating story, because his mother decided to have the body displayed in an open casket. And I suggest to you that it was a truly horrendous sight. But she wanted America, the citizens of the United States, to see what segregation was and what it meant. And they did. They saw the pictures of the thousands of mourners passing by the casket, women who passed by fainted, men were overwrought. It was a national sensation. And you think about the timing, it's the middle of the 1950s. We are engaged in a Cold War internationally. Back in Mississippi, at the trial of two men who were alleged to have committed this crime, including the original woman's husband who was whistled at, they are found not guilty by an all-white male jury. Imagine that. Basically, this white jury goes to the jury room, and as one juror said, we would have been back with a verdict quicker, but somebody gave us Cokes, somebody gave us soda pops to drink, and it took us a while to drink them. That's the way justice worked. Later on, the two men accused of this crime gave an interview to a national magazine. And there they explained that indeed they had committed the crime, how they'd done it, what was involved. But at the time, they didn't fear being tried again, double jeopardy, that you can't be tried for the same crime twice, protected them. Emmett Till is important because that case, that young man, but that case reflected in a major way the depth of the injustice of racial discrimination. Now, it's going to affect how African Americans in particular, but other groups as well, respond in the 1950s. And the next major event probably to talk about here is the Montgomery bus boycott, 1955, 1956. Most of us know the story. It's the story of a seamstress, Rosa Parks, after a long day's work, gets on the bus to go home, and most of the ridership of the Montgomery buses were African Americans. But she gets on the bus, and by that segregationist code, that Jim Crow code, she is supposed to give up her seat if all the seats are full and a white person gets on the bus and doesn't have a seat. That's the code. You move on back. She was tired. She said, "No, I'm not going to give up my seat." The bus driver then takes it upon himself to tell her to move. When she doesn't, the police are called in and she's arrested. That's the straightforward dope. I mean, that's the straightforward story. It's what happened. But we also need to understand that this notion of civil disobedience, of staying seated on a bus, of not following the code in a very careful manner is something that wasn't entirely new to Rosa Parks. It had been tried before. What made this case special was that Rosa Parks was sort of the perfect person to challenge the system. She had a good record, right? There was nothing in her background that segregationists could point to and try and pull her down. But more importantly, she had been trained in civil disobedience. She had had contact with, among other things, the Highlander Folk School, which would be an integral part of the civil rights movement from Tennessee, where training in passive resistance and civil disobedience could occur. Well, the arrest in Montgomery, Alabama of Rosa Parks led ultimately to a boycott by African Americans of the Montgomery buses. 3/4 of the riders in the bus system were African American. And the boycott lasted for approximately a year. They walked. These former bus riders walked. They carpooled. They organized ways of getting people to work, getting people to the store. It was sort of an amazing undertaking in logistics. This is also the point where a young, at this time 26-year-old Baptist minister steps onto the scene. He's from Atlanta originally, right? His name is Martin Luther King Jr. His father had been a pastor. Martin Luther King Jr. himself had gotten a PhD, gotten a doctorate. He was learned and educated, and in fact had given particular focus to the methods of civil disobedience of Mohandas Gandhi. But also he'd looked at Thoreau, and he'd looked at theologians like Reinhold Niebuhr, who had given their theology, their religious thinking, a social cast, the practical application of belief, if you will. In all these folks, he had studied passive or peaceful resistance. He was charismatic as all get out. He had the oratory, he had the voice, he had the rhythms of speech that come out of that long African American religious tradition. Powerful, powerful speaker. Most of us are familiar with Martin Luther King Jr., but it's in the context of this Montgomery bus boycott that he really first emerges as somebody to watch and becomes a guiding force in the continuation of the boycott and in uplifting or maintaining the spirits of the people involved. He becomes such a figure that by January, he actually has dynamite tossed on his front porch. It's not a free ride, this civil rights movement. Anytime you're involved, you're putting your life on the line, because this whole system of segregation is ultimately kept in place by violence. In 1956, the Supreme Court declared Alabama's Jim Crow laws unconstitutional, ordering the bus company to change its policies. In the late 1940s, the court had already acted in interstate busing under the Constitution to forbid discrimination, to forbid Jim Crow. But in this instance, the Supreme Court decides specifically about Alabama's laws regarding public accommodation, ending the boycott, but establishing in Montgomery a sort of new form of civil disobedience, of passive resistance, a new form for the movement in the 1950s. 1957, we're back to education and an instance that many of you are familiar with, the Little Rock crisis. But one of the first actual incidents of educational integration of primary and secondary schools occurs not in Little Rock, but in a little town in Tennessee called Clinton. In September of 1956, following the Brown decision and the court-ordered desegregation, a local federal judge out of Knoxville, Tennessee, actually reverses his decision, his previous decision on a court case that had come before him from Anderson County, Tennessee, in the little town of Clinton, asking that African American children be allowed to attend Clinton High School, that they were being discriminated against in no small part for the same distance issues that informed many of the cases in the Brown decision. By and large, in its initial stages, the integration of Clinton High School went relatively smoothly. It occurred. There were issues within the school, but what happens in Clinton is noteworthy, I think, because what starts out as a sort of a moderate adjustment becomes over time a much more radicalized situation. One of the radical elements is an outsider by the name of John Casper, who is the executive secretary of the Seaboard Citizens Council. This is Citizens Council from the Washington, D.C., Virginia area along the Atlantic coast. Well, he's coming from the coast all the way into Tennessee, across the mountains, basically to get everybody riled up. And it's one of those funny things that the complaint of many segregationists was that the problem that they saw, the reason for all this unhappiness among African Americans wasn't segregation, it was outside agitation. In other words, if the Yankees, if the Northerners, if the NAACP would just stay out of things, we could go on just like we've been. Everybody's been so happy together. Everybody's in their rightful place. When in fact, often what you find is that it's individuals on the segregationist side throughout the South coming from outside the region or from outside the locality in question who begin agitating, and before you know it, you have the grounds for violence. Not always the case, but it's often the case that outside agitation, if it exists, comes from outside on behalf of segregationists. And John Casper is a prime example of this. Casper begins agitating in Clinton. They go through all kinds of a hullabaloo, a white Baptist minister who's escorting the Clinton 12 to school. One day he gets beaten up, and ultimately Casper will be arrested, but before it's over, the governor of Tennessee will decide to send in the National Guard. And there's a great film about this incident. It was broadcast on television right around the holiday season. And it shows the National Guard troops moving into Clinton to quell the unrest. We began to see the destruction of property, and ultimately what happens is that while there are problems within the school and there are people pulling ponytails and people messing up lockers and those kind of things, that happens gradually. It comes on gradually until finally, while school is out of session, Clinton High School is blown up. Dynamite. There's a really fascinating story that's told of Clinton, which is very close to Oak Ridge. The Clinton students were bused to Oak Ridge to go to school after their school was blown up, after the explosion. And the first day, so the story goes, the very first day, the Oak Ridge band was in the parking lot playing to greet these students from Clinton High School. The Clinton incident gives you a sense of sort of how complicated this business could be of desegregation of schools. It's complicated by outsiders coming in. It's complicated by the mixed notions, the mixed ideas of the community itself, of Clinton. There were those who may not have liked desegregation, but they weren't going to do anything violent about it. There were those who saw these African American students as having a right to come, and they were there and they were going to be treated fairly. And then there were those who just really wanted to destroy. There's also the federal presence close by in Oak Ridge, a sort of happenstance of history. But this federal presence, remember, is being felt throughout the South in the 1950s, in part because of the Cold War, because of defense contracts, because of the missile gap that's emerging, or seems to be. Places like Huntsville, Alabama's Marshall Space Center, and Houston, Texas, and Cape Canaveral, all in the South. Well, I started out talking about the Little Rock crisis. 1957, it follows on the heels of the beginning of the Clinton incident. And many schools across the South, like Clinton, had proceeded initially with desegregation and had done so in a very sort of moderate way. Other school systems, however, had chosen to resist, had ignored the call of the court. In the fall of 1957, when school began, some 684 of 3,000 school districts in the South, only 684 of some 3,000 had actually begun to desegregate. Then in 1957, the courts had ordered the desegregation of Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. The mayor of Little Rock, as often would local mayors, preferred a moderate course, and he preferred that the orders of the court be followed. But the tension heightened. It's kind of like what happened in Clinton. Governor Orville Faubus, F-A-U-B-U-S, Governor Orville Faubus, had political ambitions and understood that if you wished to get ahead politically in the South in the 1950s, the route seemed to be through segregationist rhetoric and policies. Faubus ordered the National Guard to intervene on the claim that it was needed in Little Rock to keep order as crowds began to gather, threaten, and harass the African American students making their way to Central High School. When the federal court ordered the guard removed because the National Guard was causing more trouble in some ways than it was helping, Faubus removed the guard, and then the crowd surrounded the school and moved in to actually block students from entry. When this happened, when the school had been surrounded, blocked off by this angry mob, and you got to imagine these people shouting, yelling, spitting, throwing. it says something absolutely about the bravery of the students, the African American students, willing to make their way through that melee. Sort of on principle. And they were scared. There were numerous times when they were scared. But ultimately what happens in Little Rock, because of the mob, because of Orville Faubus's actions, that will force Dwight Eisenhower finally to act. And Eisenhower federalizes the Arkansas National Guard and sends in the 101st Airborne to maintain order and see that the federal court order was carried out. Troops will be in Little Rock the rest of the year. And you remember I mentioned historians have referred to the 1950s and 60s as the Second Reconstruction. Once again, you have federal troops, federal marshals, with weapons, with guns, basically maintaining order and enforcing federal edict in the South. It's a situation not unlike what we saw with Reconstruction. It's one of the reasons I wanted to go back and talk about Reconstruction. But what we began to see is that resistance. It still goes on. Many of the white students who had attended Central High School in Little Rock are pulled out by parents and sent to private schools. There are boycotts of the public education system by white parents in Little Rock. And 1958, 1959, public high schools are closed. The idea being, rather than allow African Americans to sit in chairs to learn, it's better to deny all students who can't afford private education access to public education. I don't know what you think, but as a matter of principle, that seems a bit stupid. And yet, that's how far segregationists were more than willing to go, to stop this process of desegregation in the South. In 1957, Eisenhower signed off on the first of a series of civil rights laws that were considered by Congress. It was designed to protect black voting rights with federal support, but it was weak and relatively limited in terms of enforcement. And yet you can see by the shift toward this law, the use of federal authority, that the winds are changing, perhaps, at least as far as the national government's concerned. So that's a brief overview of the 1950s and civil rights. We'll pick up in the next segment talking about how the civil rights movement evolves, how it changes as we move into the 1960s.